Yeah, he started making all kind of spatial arrangements for it.
Yeah, we'll get into what Boaz thought of Ruth tonight. But I feel like we're at the end of the next section. We made it through the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. You could, I think you could probably lump together Joshua, Judges, and Ruth as the same time period, the period of the confederacy of the 12 tribes before that they are truly established into a nation under a king. After last week's lesson on Judges, I'm really looking forward to reading about Ruth. It's a much better story. It's actually a feel-good story about folks who actually love the Lord and trust the Lord and follow the Lord. But before we get into the book of Ruth, Jim, can you go to Leviticus chapter 25? And Mike, can you go to Deuteronomy chapter 25? And you know what? While we're at it, Ed, why don't you go to Matthew chapter 22?
Am I supposed to be in Leviticus 25?
Yep, you're supposed to be in Leviticus 25. Mike is in Deuteronomy 25. And Ed is going to Matthew 22. So let me find my place here.
It's a short chapter.
So Leviticus 25, and there's a reason that we're going back to these different passages. It's because it's a theme that we're going to see throughout the book of Ruth, a theme of redemption. And I want to give us a little bit of a footing as to what redemption meant in that time period. It's stuff that we glossed over when we were in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but we didn't get into the nuts and bolts of any of this stuff. This is the part of the book where we said, yep, this is the law. And then we glossed over it and went to the next part. But so Leviticus 25, the backdrop of Leviticus 25 is the instructions on the year of Jubilee. Very interesting year. We're not going to get into it tonight, but very interesting year where debts would be essentially forgiven. But there are some things that tie into the year of Jubilee, talking on redemption of property. So Ed or Jim, if you could read just verses 23, 24, and 25 for us.
Okay. The land must not be sold prematurely, because of the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells some of his property, his nearest relative is to come and redeem what his countryman has sold.
So we'll stop there, and I'll just summarize the rest of what that law is. So essentially, God's saying that whenever you sell land, it's not sold in perpetuity. It's just sold for a time until the time of the year of Jubilee, because essentially all of our land is borrowed, isn't it? It's just on loan from God, everything that we have. So the Lord codified that into their civil law in Leviticus. But what it's talking about, discussing if a brother becomes poor and sells part of his property. So this would be a guy who's down on his luck. He's having hard times financially, and he has to sell his property. His brother or his next of kin, his closest relative, had first dibs on that property, whether they would buy it or whether they would not. So when they would redeem the land, is the phrasing that they're using, is that the brother would buy the land, to keep it in the family. So it wasn't always a good deal to buy the land. Say that you have a guy, let's just use modern terms. Say I had a brother who had a 3,000 square foot house on 20 acres with a big in-ground swimming pool in the back. And he loses his job, has to pay his bills, and he offers it up to me to sell it to me for pennies on the dollar. That'd be great, but I also have to take on his mortgage too. So it's not just the possessions that went with it, it was also the obligations, the liabilities, any debts, any servants that were with the land. You'd have to be able to feed and clothe the servants. You'd have to take care of all the livestock. It was not just a matter of taking the property from your brother because he couldn't pay for it anymore or because he needed the money. It was taking on his obligations, paying the debts that he couldn't pay. And that's the key phrase that I want to focus in on tonight, is specifically the debt that he couldn't pay. And that'll come around at the very end in an exciting way. Okay, so there's another form of redemption that is in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Mike, can you read verses 5 through 10?
If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, "My husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me." Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, "I do not want to marry her," his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled."
Okay, so it's not about the sandals, but I want you to remember the sandals as we get into the story of Ruth, because again, that's something that'll come up. So this is really another form of redemption. This is talking about if your brother had died without a male heir, without a son. It was much more than just marrying his spouse. Now, when we talk about marriage in contexts like this, when we talk about marriage in the law, I think we have an unhealthy view. I don't know if you guys would agree, but I feel like we have an unhealthy view of marriage in modern society, where when we think of marriage, we inextricably think of sex, to where that's the main point of marriage. Marriage isn't just about sex; it's about so many other things. And the point of this law that was given here, it really, society would frown upon this in modern times, I believe. You marrying your deceased brother's widow, because society would just think of the physical component of it. But it was much more than that. By marrying your brother's widow, you were, in a sense, bringing back his name from the dead. If he were to die without a male heir, he's the end of his line. But by this brother, this kinsman stepping in and saying, "No, I will take my brother's place. I will take care of his family. I will continue on his name through my line as well." It was really an act of love to his brother. And we're going to see, the reason I highlight these two specifically is because we're going to see these two play out in the story of Ruth. So Ed, we're just going to hang out in Matthew for just a moment, but you had Matthew 22:24. And I don't have my notes straight for that one, so we're going to learn this one together.
Okay, the title of this section is Marriage at the Resurrection, verse 24.
Yep.
Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and have children for him.
Okay. Yeah. So this is probably a lesson that you've heard. It's really a lesson about heaven, but it's just Jesus reaffirming the Old Testament law here. Because the question would be brought up, well, what if a man had 6 brothers and each of them died and they each married the same woman? Who would she be married to in heaven? Jesus used that as a lesson to say, well, there's not going to be marriage in heaven. But it just goes back to Jesus is affirming what was taught in the Old Testament. It's not about physical relations. Yes, physical relations are involved to make kids, shockingly enough, but it's about raising up a son in your brother's stead. It's doing something that he can't do because he's died. It really is about raising up his name from the dead. It sounds dramatic, but that was the purpose and the reason behind it. Okay, so now we're going to actually get into the book of Ruth. It's 4 chapters. It's nice and short. If we read straight through, it would take about 15 minutes. So, tell you what, we're going to try to read through the entire book tonight. Does that sound good? We got a half hour left. Think we can do it?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, I'll start out by, I'll read most of it. I will call on you guys every now and then to take a passage. But I'll start out in Ruth 1:1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. That's a fun start to the story. So it's sometime in the book of Judges where this takes place. We don't know exactly when, but there was a famine in the land, and that caused Elimelech to pick up his family and take them into Moabite territory. They didn't have any food, so they were following the food. And when they get there, they have 2 kids, but then Elimelech dies. The 2 boys marry Moabite women, not Israelite women, but Gentile women, who they were not supposed to marry. But the Lord used, even in their disobedience, the Lord's going to use them for a great purpose, very great purpose that you'll see at the end. So they marry these Moabite women, and then the boys died. Both of the sons died. So Naomi, she's in a foreign country. Her husband has died. Her sons have died. She's just stuck there by herself with both of her daughters-in-law. Her daughters-in-law are still young. They're still beautiful. By the context of the story, we can tell that. So let's just go ahead and move on. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law and went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, and go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So what's going on here is Naomi's going back home. She's packing her bags. She's leaving Moab. And she tells the girls to go and find other men. She's too old to have kids. Even if she could have kids, it's not like they're going to wait around for these boys to grow up. So, a very tragic start to the story. A lot of crying for good reason. And Orpah went back home, but it says that Ruth clung to her. Verse 15, and she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and most importantly, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the name Ruth actually means friend. Ruth was very dedicated to Naomi in a way that very few women are dedicated to their mother-in-laws. Ruth had a true and undying love for this woman, Naomi, and she was going to stick with her. And she was going to go back to the Israelite people. She was going to become a foreigner in a land that she didn't know and serve the God of the Israelites. Verse 19, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity on me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And that's the entirety of chapter 1 here. What's one thing that you guys notice about Naomi? Does Naomi seem happy?
That's not why she said my name is Mara.
Yeah. She's so unhappy. She's so bitter that she changes her name to describe that the Lord has been bad to her. That's what Mara meant. Naomi begins this story very, very bitter. She's mourning the loss of her husband and her sons, which is understandable. But in her mourning, she is refusing to look at what God has left her with, which is Ruth, this amazing, wonderful person in her life. And God has used the death of her husband and her sons to return her to her people. So when she gets back home, people recognize her. They're excited to see her, but she can't get over her bitterness. Okay, chapter 2. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young woman who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early in the morning until now, except for a short rest. So what Ruth did was, keep in mind, Naomi's fairly old at this time. She doesn't move around very well. Ruth is young and healthy. So they come back from Moab into Judah, and they have to find a way to eat. So Ruth says, "You know what? I'm just going to go pick up the scraps. After Boaz's servants go and glean the field, I'll go pick up what they don't gather, just enough to feed you and me. How's that sound, Naomi?" And she says, "Yep, that's a good idea." But now Boaz has spotted her. And Boaz spotted her pretty quick, didn't he? I think there's a reason that Boaz spotted her. And Boaz liked what he saw when he saw Ruth. I'll just leave it at that. So, just in keeping with the theme that this is a happier story than the book of Judges, even though it hasn't started out happy, what is the very first thing that Boaz says when he comes and he greets them? He says, "The Lord be with you." So we know that Boaz is trying to serve the Lord. Now, is he a perfect man? I'm sure he's not. But we do see that Boaz is a man who's actively trying to serve the Lord. He's trying to honor the God of his fathers. So we're actually cooking along pretty good. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Why do you think she found favor in his eyes, Ed?
Because he started giving her, I'll say, presents, being able to grain, pick up a lot of grain. Because there were laws about how they were to harvest their fields and leave the corner of the fields for the poor people. They may left a pretty good bunch of grain behind for her to pick up.
And they were, he also offers her protection, doesn't he? So a lone immigrant woman out in the field by herself, she was liable. She was in danger. She was in more danger than what you and I probably realized. But Boaz not only was giving her food, but he was also giving her protection. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." So, Mike, do you want to take over and read 14 through 23?
At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah.
Ephah?
Ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I work with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth, the Moabite, said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's fields you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
So you should notice with Naomi's attitude, it's starting to change, isn't it? She went from being totally bitter, wanting to call herself Mara, but she sees that, okay, we've got food, somebody is taking care of Ruth, but you also see the wheels are starting to turn in Naomi's head. Naomi was older, she was probably a little bit wiser, and she was probably a fairly shrewd woman who's starting to think about what Boaz has to offer them and how they might snag Boaz to help the both of them out. So, Ed, would you read chapter 3, verses 1 through 5?
Sunday, Naomi, her mother-in-law said to her daughter, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz with those servant girls you have been a kinsman of ours? Tonight we will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but do not let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Go then and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to
Oh, we can stop right there for a minute.
the
Do you guys understand what's going on here? They're laying a trap of sorts for Boaz. I wouldn't necessarily call it entrapment, but they are going to put Boaz in a position where he's going to listen. So what's going on? Remember, it's a key to the story that we sort of glanced over, was that they are getting there at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the reason that Boaz is not going to be sleeping in his own bed is he's going to be sleeping on the threshing floor. That's where they would go and they would process the grain, so they would have something that they could actually go and sell. It was a very arduous, tedious, back-breaking process. But on the threshing floor is where all of the grain would accumulate. So what Boaz is doing is essentially he is guarding his investment by sleeping on the threshing floor. That's why he's not sleeping in his own bed in his own house. And Naomi knows this. So Naomi tells Ruth to go and sneak in after he's gone to bed, to uncover his feet and just lay down at his feet. There's nothing inappropriate going on per se, but from an outsider looking in, they might not believe that if you told them. So what Ruth is doing is she's laid down at the foot of his bed. She's uncovered his feet, knowing that at some point in time, his feet are going to get cold and he's going to realize, wait a second, I'm not laying here by myself. That's when he's going to jump up. So that's where we'll pick up in verse 6. Jim, do you want to read verses 6 through 9?
So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer."
So there's that word redeemer, kinsman redeemer, popping up again. That's why we went back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, because there were essentially two functions that Boaz was going to fulfill in one. The first was the issue of the land. So Naomi had lands back where she came from, because remember, that's where her and her husband started, was in Judah. But since her husband died and her sons died, by law, there was really nothing that she could do with the land because she didn't have a male heir. So when Naomi realizes that Boaz is a close family member, she's starting to realize that, okay, there's something that he can do for me, and there's something that he can do for Ruth. So that's why it's important that Ruth points out that he is a kinsman redeemer. And I'll read the next little section here. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or whether poor or rich." You guys know what he's saying there? So I'm assuming that Boaz is an older fella. Probably not a spring chicken anymore. Probably not the best looking guy. And he's saying that Ruth's greatest kindness is to pick an old portly man over a young guy who's handsome and good looking. He's saying that he's a charity case when it comes to looks, and it's nice that she obliged. But let's go on. "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." So he's essentially admitted that he thinks that she is drop dead gorgeous. But why does he say that he's going to do what she asked him to? It's not because of her looks. It's because of her reputation. The people around knew that Ruth was a worthy woman. They knew that she was a woman worthwhile. And Boaz knew that if he were to take on this young woman, that he was going to have a wonderful wife, not just something to look at. "And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning." So what he's saying there is, by law, it had to be the closest relative. If it was a direct brother of Elimelech, he would have rights before Boaz, who might have been a cousin or whatever, or an uncle. But there was somebody in line who was closer to Elimelech than Boaz. So Boaz says, all right, I will redeem you, but we have to give this guy first dibs to follow the law. So she lay at his feet until morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. So you know how I said that there was no funny business that happened that night? There really wasn't any funny business. There was no fornication, no sin had happened. It was just Ruth finding a way to get to Boaz in a manner where he would listen to her and where she could speak with him privately. But there was no impropriety that happened. So she goes and she leaves before daybreak, so nobody would know that she was there on the threshing floor with Boaz. And Boaz made sure that he was protecting her reputation and wanted to make sure that nobody else knew that Ruth came there to visit him that night. Because it was just a visit. It was an innocent visit. Okay. So we're at verse 15. And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." So I think mother-in-law is starting to get a little bit excited. She knows what's going on. Ruth didn't have to tell her what was going on. When Boaz sent the 6 measures of barley with her, specifically for Naomi, Naomi knew that they had it. Naomi knew at that point in time that he was head over heels for Ruth, and she also knew that Boaz was going to take on the responsibilities in Naomi's deceased husband's place. Okay, so now we're already in chapter 4. We're already at the end of it. Look at that. So, Mike, will you read verses 1 through 6?
Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative
Elimelech.
Yeah, him. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here, in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem. I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it."
Okay, so what Boaz did, he was going to settle it that same day, just like Naomi said, is he found the next of kin, found him in the city. He tracked him down. He gathered, or he told him, "All right, come over here." And then he gathered up 10 elders to be witnesses, essentially, because it was going to be a legal contract that was made that day. So there were 2 parts of the redemption. That's why we went to both Leviticus and Deuteronomy. The first part of the redemption was redeeming the land from Naomi. When he says that Naomi is going to be selling a parcel of land, it was really tied into her husband. It was not selling, and it was not to be sold free and clear like what we might sell a field around here in Morrow County. There was something deeper going on. So this next of kin was willing to take on the land. So he was willing to take on the physical obligations, the financial obligations. But then Boaz said, "Oh, wait, there's a catch. So if you take the land, you also have to marry Ruth." The reason that you have to marry Ruth is because, well, you know what? Let me ask you guys. Why did he say that he would have to marry Ruth as opposed to marrying Naomi? There is a right answer to this question. What was the purpose of the kinsman redeemer from the beginning of the lesson?
To continue the line.
To continue the line. So why would it have to be Ruth? Why couldn't it be Naomi?
Naomi's old.
Yep, that's exactly it. Naomi was past the childbearing years. But because Naomi already had a son and Ruth married that son, then it would go from Naomi to Ruth. Is it about as clear as mud? Yeah. So Ruth was going to carry on essentially her father-in-law's name through this kinsman redeemer. But then the one who was first in line said, no, there's a lot more obligations that come with that. It would muddy the water. He probably had a firstborn son of his own, so he didn't want to mix the families. He didn't want to try to mix up and split inheritances between two firstborns. He wanted his name to be the name that was remembered. But the irony of that is we have no idea what this man's name is, but we know Boaz's name. So Boaz was faithful, and Boaz got remembered. The guy who tried to preserve his own name ended up losing it. I think Jesus said something similar to that. Whoever would want to save his life shall lose it. Whoever would lose his life shall save it. Very bad summary by me, but I think you get the point. So I'll read 7 through 12 here, and then I'll pass it off to Ed, but for verse 13. Now this was the custom in the former time of Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. You may act worthily in Ephrath and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring of the Lord, or because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So, remember in Leviticus 25, we talked about the sandal. Again, I don't know what the point of the sandal is, but that's just the way that they confirm these kind of contracts. So it was Boaz saying that I'm essentially going to walk in Elimelech's shoes, if you want to use that as just a way to remember. But again, I want to highlight what was the point of him marrying Ruth to bear children. The answer is in verse 10.
Well, it says to maintain the name of the dead with his property.
To perpetuate the name of the dead, to raise up his name from the dead. Nobody would remember Elimelech because he died, his sons died, he had no male heirs. His land would have just been gobbled up if it weren't for this kinsman redeemer. But because there was a kinsman redeemer, somebody from the family who was able to redeem not only the land, but to redeem his widow, or in this case, his son's widow, his name would be able to live on through the line of Boaz. So, Ed, would you read verses 13 through 16. And stop at 16. Don't go to 17 yet.
Yeah. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth."
All right. So Naomi started out the story very bitter, didn't she? But I think she's finally starting to realize that the Lord is blessing her all along. So God has the right to change our lives any way that he sees fit, according to his plan, according to his purposes. Whether or not we would agree and whether or not we like it. So Naomi's life was turned upside down. But God is faithful in his promises, isn't he? There's always light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully we can see this light before we die, but sometimes we have to wait till we get to the other side of heaven to see any light. But we have to trust in God's purposes. We have to trust in God's plans. We don't have to trust what's going on in the moment. We don't have to trust the things around us. All we have to trust in is that God is in control and that God loves us and God knows what's best for us. So Naomi went through all of this tragedy. She went through all of this bitterness. And then finally she looks around. Boaz marries Ruth and she realizes, wow, Ruth was really better to me than 7 sons were. And so Ruth and Boaz have a baby. And I'll just read it for you. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And then these two became inseparable. So picture this image of an old widow who is bitter, sad, and lonely, and God blesses her with a baby. It's wonderful, the relationship that she got to have with her grandson to bring that joy back into her life. So I had mentioned about the redemption being all about raising the name of the dead and continuing on the line. So that's where we get to the whole point of the story, the pinnacle of the story here is in verses 17 through 22. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So he was so close with his grandma, the women joked around and said that it was actually Naomi's son, not Ruth's son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse. Who's Jesse?
Father of David.
The father of David. And if we were to go down throughout the generations, who do we find at the end of the line from David? It's not mentioned here, but it's mentioned in the New Testament to give you a hint.
The King of Kings.
The King of Kings, Jesus Christ himself, came through the line of David, through the line of Jesse, through the line of Obed, through the line of Ruth and Boaz. So what started out way in the beginning of the story with Elimelech and Naomi leaving Judah to go to Moab, and his 2 sons marrying Moabite women who they shouldn't have been marrying. God used them, killed them off for his purposes, brought Ruth back to Judah so that Ruth would eventually be the great, I lost track, grandma of Jesus himself. It's just amazing how the Lord works, isn't it? And then it goes and finishes off with the...
And it's amazing that it's in Bethlehem area.
Yes, in Bethlehem specifically. It never ceases to amaze me how the Lord worked in the scriptures and how the Lord continues to work to fulfill his plans. Really, if I've got a lesson for us to learn from this story, it's that even in the bad, God is still good, isn't he? So with that, we're gonna come to a close. I do have a very, very short video. It's only a minute and a half that I'm going to play for you guys that sort of summarizes the end of the book. Feels a little anticlimactic because it took us a while to get there, but I get very excited when I realized what God was doing when he was setting up the story of Ruth.
Based on today's ancestry, was Ruth like either the great great or great grandmother of David?
So she would have been so Ruth was David's grandma's or grandpa's mom. Did I get that right? Obed, Jesse, David. So, yes, Ruth would have been David's great grandma, which does help us peg it to a timeline a little bit. And with us being within a couple of generations of David, that should tell us where we're going next. We're going to be getting into 1 Samuel next week. We'll probably do 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel as separate weeks, although they are a continuing story. But that'll take us from Saul through David and finally on to Solomon. So we're getting to the fulfilled promises of the Lord. We're getting into the really the pinnacle of Israel as a nation. We're right on the cusp of it. So any comments, questions on Ruth before we finish off the study and watch the video?
I read it in a different translation, I think last night, and it talked about the grain was parched grain. And immediately I thought of my grandmother who used to parch corn. And it was a snack like eating popcorn almost. So they would parch or heat up different grains to start to turn brown, a little bit brown. And it would be edible and digestible, or more digestible.
Mm-hmm. It was probably pretty tasty.
That's something that stuck in my mind last night when I was reading through this.
Well, I mean, when we read these stories, these are people who live lives. Yeah, the world's changed a whole lot in the last several thousand years, but they were people just like us. They enjoyed foods very similar to what we enjoy.
I don't know if they had popcorn back then days or not.
I don't know. That was before Orville Redenbacher's time.